You've already been seeing some amazing things as you walk along with Jesus. As I said earlier, he's teaching, he's healing, he's casting out demons. There's these amazing things that are happening. And the disciples, one by one, it's almost like the light is starting to switch on. The light is starting to switch on as to who Jesus is. In the last chapter, in Mark chapter 8, we see that Peter has had his moment of realization. In that moment when being asked who he thought Jesus was, he says, "You're the Messiah. You are the Christ. You're the one." The light bulb had gone on for Peter about Jesus. But now it's taken to the next level. They could not have imagined what it was going to be like. Let's put it in some very human terms. Remember, the disciples are just getting to understand who the rabbi, who the teacher was. This is how ridiculous it was. Imagine you and me were to go tomorrow up to Glen Sannox, park our car down by the beach and walk up Glen Sannox into the hills. And then all of a sudden, a great bright shining light comes from heaven, and then there's Andrew Clark and Moses and Elijah standing there, and Andrew Clark is shining like a silly thing, shining like a beacon. You'd be thinking, oh, I think you'd be terrified. I would be terrified, but you'd be terrified. But that's how stark this would have been. At this point in time, these disciples are still relatively in the dark about who Jesus was. Think about how incredulous you would feel. Think about how shocked and surprised you would feel to see Jesus. This is the guy you've been eating with, you've been walking with, you've been laughing with, you've been joking with, you've been learning from. And then all of a sudden, something happens to him and you see this glory. And you see these figures from history stand beside him. And you're absolutely stuck for words. There's actually some comedy moments in here. I don't know if you noticed them. But, Peter, James and John, they're there and they're seeing this and they're thinking, what will we do? I know what we'll do. We'll build a building for the glory of God. They said, Jesus, Elijah, Moses standing in front of them with all their glory. And what they want to do is, let's build a building. So we've got it from history. When we see the glory of God, we want to put a building, we want to put a church on it. But that's what they did. They said, let's build a shelter. Let's build something to sort of institutionalize and mark in the ground something that will remember this encounter. But it wasn't like that at all. And we're told that they were speaking out of their, I don't know what to make of this. And so we built stuff. But actually, where the attention needed to be wasn't on remembering in long history by building a shelter for Jesus, Moses and Elijah, but it was about encountering and remembering and living in the glory of God. So there's the first thing I want to challenge you about today. Always be pursuing the presence and the glory of God. Haven't you been in some beautiful churches in your life? Some of these big, huge, ornate buildings. I mean, I love a cathedral. Especially when we're down in the northeast. One of the things I love to do on a day off is take myself down to Durham Cathedral, because it's a feat of engineering. It's a grand, beautiful, glorious building. But in comparison to the beauty and the glory of Jesus, as he leads us into the courts of his presence, it's nothing. It's just bricks and mortar, one stone on top of the other. Let's continually be ushered into the presence of Jesus. This Transfiguration message is packed full of significance. Now, I've got a confession to make. You ready for confession? It's good for the soul. I had no clue what to make of the Transfiguration for a lot of my earlier Christian life. I'm talking about a good 10, 15 years of my Christian life. I would look at the Transfiguration and think, I have no idea what's going on here. What is this for? This just seems weird to me. Because a lot of the Gospel of Mark in particular, and the other Gospels, are really emphasising the tremendous human that Jesus was. Yes, he was moving in the power of the Spirit and doing amazing things. But for me, initially, I sometimes felt that the Transfiguration was spoiling it. It was almost like it was turning Jesus into a ghost. I couldn't comprehend it until I started to see we're seeing something here which is just an inkling of what is to come, an inkling of what God wants to impart for us. So let's see what's going to happen. Let's think about what's happening here in this Transfiguration story. The first thing is, we are seeing for the first time, with no shadow of doubt, a confirmation of the divine nature of Jesus. It's been rumoured up until this point. It's been thought about up until this point. People are starting to think, there's something about this guy. But here for Peter, James and John, what they're seeing is nothing short of divinity. The Jesus that has been walking beside them is indeed the Son of Man. He is indeed the Son of God. He is the Christ. He is the all-powerful one. He is the amazing one, the bright, shining one. It's a confirmation. And that was a needful confirmation because they needed to understand that as they now walked towards Jerusalem, as they would encounter all that was going to happen there, these guys needed to have this in the back of their minds as they observed all that would happen to Jesus. And even then, we know that the disciples got the jitters in the last minute. Even in spite of being witnesses to this amazing confirmation of the divine nature of God, they got the jitters when it got really, really difficult. And I think there's something powerful in there for us. Or there is, at least for me. Because we all have had those times, I think, in our lives where we realise something tremendous about Jesus. But then sometimes we come into situations in our life where it's like we never experienced the divine power of God at all. We turn to our own human instincts. We turn to our own feelings. We turn to our own fears. And all of a sudden, we get very human. Or it might just be me. Is it just me? Is it just me? You know, we have had this revelation of who Jesus is, the shining one. But then within a few chapters of our daily lives, it's as if we've never seen it at all. It's as if we've imagined it. It's as if it's a dream. But here we have a confirmation. Jesus' face shines like the sun. Remember like what Moses' face shone like when he came down off of the mountain when he received the law? Well, nothing in comparison to that. This was pure white brilliance. What they were seeing here is a prefiguration of what Jesus appears like in the opening chapters of Revelation. Absolutely dazzling. He's divine. But even in their own experience, they must have in that moment knew that Jesus was something more. But still they would forget. Well, there's encouragement for you. We often have to remind ourselves to return to the presence of God, to return to the glory of God and to see him again. That's why it's so wonderful to sing that little chorus, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus, because I can guarantee you that before this day is out, you probably have had an experience where you've forgotten what Jesus looks like at all. You know? And it can happen as soon as you drive your car out of the car park, because somebody will probably cut you up, or somebody will be going too slow, or somebody will be going too fast, or there'll be a cyclist, and all of a sudden it's as if you hadn't seen Jesus today, you know. But Jesus shows himself as being the divine one. Of course, it's also a foreshadowing of Jesus' resurrection. It's a foreshadowing of Jesus' resurrection. We're told that his clothes become white. He's become the victor over sin and death. He's the bright, shining one, as I've said. And appears in this too, the presence of Moses and Elijah. Don't you think that's a bit weird? Isn't that a bit weird? You don't think that's a bit weird? You're up there with Jesus. Not only is he shining like nothing else on earth, but Moses and Elijah, people who have been dead and gone for, 1,000 years at least, all of a sudden you can recognize them talking to Jesus. And what are they doing? Do you know what they were talking about? Anyone know? No one knows. Well, you need to look in Luke's Gospel in this encounter. And we're told that Moses and Elijah are talking to Jesus about Jesus' departure. Isn't that spectacular? So someone's obviously been there listening into that conversation. Imagine being there listening to Jesus and Moses and Elijah talking about Jesus' departure, how it was all going to be. Jesus in that moment is receiving a confirmation from the whole panoply of heaven, all God's witnesses, that what is about to happen as he moves towards Jerusalem is in the very centre of God's plan. It's in the very centre of his purpose. Jesus is receiving a fresh and full revelation. There's also a sense of completion in this moment of transfiguration. Does anyone know what Moses represents in the Old Testament? I can hear people saying the law. Moses represents the law that came down from Mount Sinai, the instructions and the things that were in place that made the people of God the people of God. Does anyone know what Elijah represents? The prophets. Someone said the prophets. The prophets. He represents power. Elijah is synonymous with power. Remember that time when he was up Mount Carmel with his face off with the prophets of Baal, and God answers by power through the ministry of Elijah. So you've got the symbol of the law and the prophets, the teaching and the power being there in that moment, and it's almost as if in the divine transformation of Jesus, we've got the perfect combination of the both. It's like they come together in the person of Jesus. And that is the model on which the people of Jesus will go forward on. I want to say to you again and again and again, in our experience of Christian life, we must be able to hold Moses and Elijah together. And the way we do that is through centering on the person of Jesus Christ. We must be people who are in the Word, and we must be people who are in the Spirit. When you take them apart, you're separating Jesus. You're separating the glory of Jesus. So we want to be those who are in the Word, grounded in the Word of God and grounded in the Spirit of God. And that will mean for us sometimes moving out of our comfort zone. It will sometimes mean moving out of our comfort zone. Do you think for a second that Peter, James and John were in their comfort zone as they saw Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration? Absolutely not. But there in that moment, you had the Word and the Spirit culminating in the glory of Jesus. There is a need for the church today to look to the Word and to look to the Spirit to guide us into all truth and to enable us to live as we should live. It's a foretelling of Jesus' resurrection and all that was being accomplished in him. The amazing thing is, the disciples here must have been encouraged. They must have been encouraged by this. They didn't know what to do with it, but they must have been encouraged. There will be times in your life, as I've said already, when you face a situation and you're going to need past experiences to help you. You're going to need past experiences to help you. And I've probably told you this story before, but I'm going to tell you again because it's relevant. When I became a Christian on the 17th of October 1995, when I was there kneeling on the floor, I did the thing, I did the repenting, and I did I got through. There was that sense of relief and that sense of having come into new life. But afterwards, when I went home, I knew that if this was going to be an experience that I could take forward and be strengthened to live, I needed to know beyond all doubt that God was there. And I said, God, if this is a thing, you're going to have to show me. I don't know we're supposed to ask for those sorts of things, but I did say, God, if this is real, if what has happened is real, you're going to have to show me. And then I understand backwards that what happened to me in my little room at 16 Mount View in the back end of Dreghorn, in my bedroom that I'd been, the presence of God filled that place in a tangible way. And even as I speak on it, the hairs, well, not many hairs on the back of my neck, but the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And there have been so many times in my life where there's been trouble and where there's been trial and where there's been fear and where there's been doubt that has been extinguished. Because that sense, that reassurance, that encounter with God comes back. When I'm at the lowest place you can possibly go, it's not too long before I recognise, actually, I've always been in the everlasting arms of God. There is nowhere that I have been where underneath me have been those arms that have held me and that have shown me once again the power of presence. Like the disciples here, there were definitely times coming for them where they would have to cast their minds back to their experience of Jesus. And you might find yourself in a situation now where, well, I'm not sure what's happening. But there will be times in your past, maybe your recent past, where you can say, well, I saw the glory of God there. And sometimes that's what we have to go on until we can get ourselves into the space of understanding what God's doing in the moment. So I'm looking at your face. I don't know what's going on in your life just now. I don't know if you're in a sweet, happy place or whether in your place of not sure what's quite going on. But the witness of God in your life is there. And they do stand within us, like almost like cairns, like stones of remembrance. The old people of the Old Testament were always putting up big piles of stones there because that was the place where God helped us. That was the place where God helped us. And we need to have those in our lives. Not that we go back there and wish for a happier day in the past, but as a remembrance that the God who helped us in the past will help us now. These disciples would have been strengthened for everything which was about to come. But do you notice, Jesus says, don't tell anybody about this. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? You know what it's like? You know what it's like when you go along the street and you see one of those signs, don't touch wet paint. You seen those? Those little signs, don't touch wet paint? Who in the world can resist touching just to make sure? Or you know, when told not to play ball games on a particular field, don't you just wish you had a ball in that moment so you could kick it up against the pole? We push the envelope every single time. We're chancellors, every single one of us. But you imagine hearing those words from Jesus. They've just done something tremendous. And Jesus says, don't tell. Don't tell. Remember what we said last week. Jesus is in the process of turning his direction towards Jerusalem. And he knows that that will mean his death. He knows that that will mean his end. But he also knows that it will mean his glory. How? Because Moses and Elijah have just reminded him. And he's saying to them, look, guys, don't tell anyone about this. Because we are in the business of changing people's minds to know and to understand what exactly the Messiah is. Who exactly the Messiah is. What it means when he comes. Don't tell anyone about this until it is the right moment. Until the population at large were aware of what Jesus was bringing, that was the moment when they could bring it into the light. And so they were sitting with this sense of something that is going to happen. It's a little bit like when you're praying, you know, when you're praying, and maybe you're praying for anyone praying for their sons or their daughters or their cousins or their neighbours, and you're hoping and you're hoping and you're praying and you can see in your mind's eye, hopefully the day where they'll be in worship, where they'll be in fellowship, where they'll be in glory. But right now you're just sitting with it. You're sitting with the promise. You're sitting with the revelation and you're waiting for it to come to pass. It's almost a little bit like that. This, don't tell anyone about it. It's being able to sit with the glory of the presence of God and realizing that the one that you're encountering is the divine one whose purposes will come to pass. Whose purposes will come to pass. What has God been saying to you recently? What promises are you sitting with? What sense of God about to move in your own life, in your own circumstances, are you sitting with? What is your deepest hope that you're sitting with? Sometimes there's a discipline in the sitting and in the waiting. Sometimes there's something powerfully transformative that happens in that moment. As Jesus' disciples move with him towards the cross, can you even imagine what they were experiencing? Think about what their experience must have been observing Jesus on the cross. That's the ones that had the heart and the stomach to stay and watch. Think about what it must have been on that Saturday in between the cross and the resurrection. Think about the waiting and the sense in your gut that they must have felt. Think about that first resurrection day when you knew that Jesus had been saying that he was going to be risen from the dead, that he would be coming back. Think about what you must have been feeling, the pregnancy of expectation in that moment, until all of a sudden you realise that the one who was transfigured on the mountain is the one who went to the cross, the one who went to the tomb, and the one who is back. And then imagine, finally, standing on that hillside when you see Jesus ascend into his glory. I'm sure that Peter, James and John were back on that mountain of Transfiguration. And it's like, he's done it. God has done it. He's done it. But in between those two pillars of Jesus' experience, the Transfiguration and the Ascension, was a whole load of pain, a whole load of anxiety, a whole load of trouble. So there's hope, folks. In between these experiences in our lives, in the waiting, in the pain, in the not sure what's going to happen, there is a realization of hope that's going to come. I have to say that I'm starting to think that Transfiguration is one of my favourite bits of the Bible. It's just a tremendous revelation of hope and promise that God is going to accomplish, but seen in advance. God is showing us all the things that he is going to do in that ultimate day. But here we are in the middle, stuck with each other, but waiting on the promise of God to come into fruition here and now and in the future. Isn't that an exciting place to be? Isn't that the best place to be? Looking for the signs of the coming of the kingdom of God until one day the river will flow from the throne. Every eye will see him and everything will be changed. I don't know about you, but that changes the perspective of your Monday morning. You know, we're waiting for the coming glory of Jesus in all his power.